Okay, everyone, I just wanted to repeat some introductions. I'm Shelley Wolfberg, Assistant to the City Manager, and we are pleased to welcome city staff and also our Loyola Marymount University researchers led by Dr. Eric Strauss. This meeting is being recorded and the whole presentation will be uploaded on our city website for Coyotes. So you will be able to see this presentation at your leisure. We request that if you have a question to please put that in the chat and we'll answer questions at the end of the meeting. And if you somehow for some reason you need to jump off the call, please know that you'll be able to view the presentation at a later date and city staff is always available to talk to you. So I'm going to, let me see, I'm going to unmute. We're going to do a little more introduction here. So from our police department, we have Soraya Estrada. And if you could introduce your team and your role. Let me see. Okay, go ahead. Oh, shoot. Why can't I unmute? Hold on. Sorry, technical difficulties. Sorry about that, Sarai. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself and your team? I don't know why he's still.
Okay, there we go. Good evening. This is Lieutenant Sarai Estrada from the Police Department. With us tonight is going to be Sergeant Kyle Hauk and our Animal Services Officer, Dayton Shores.
And I see, I don't know if you mentioned our Assistant Chief Troy Dunlap is on this call. And we welcome Dayton and also Kyle on this for this presentation. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Go ahead, Dr. Strauss. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. And let me, you still need to make me a co-host in order for me to share. Oh, okay. I think we're all set now. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Yes, perfect.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you as well to the various staff members at the City of Culver City that have helped us over the past 3 years on this project. It's really been an extraordinary journey, an odyssey that included dealing with the challenges of COVID and what the county would allow us and not allow us to do. Luckily, our study was considered important for public health, so we were allowed to continue when most research in the Los Angeles area was held in abeyance for some number of months. We were asked in 2019 to initiate a management study for Culver City in order to provide guidance in management of what had become and still remains a significant conflict. We were responding really to the trauma and harm that had been caused by coyotes that had taken dozens and dozens of cats by the time we had, some 70 cats by the time we had joined. Our team was asked because of our long history in studying coyotes on both coasts of North America, and it goes back even farther than that. During my doctoral studies with endangered shorebirds, one of the primary predators were coyotes, and we were the team in 1987 that developed some of the first coyote-proof fencing to put around endangered shorebird nests to help protect them during the vulnerable incubation phase. I'm joined tonight by two colleagues who played incredibly important roles in the study. I'm Eric Strauss. I'm President's Professor of Biology at LMU and also the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Resilience. Dr. Melinda Weaver, who is now at Arizona State University, was the postdoctoral research fellow who led the field component of this study, did an extraordinary job, spent 3 years in residence with us. And Michelle Romolini, Dr. Romolini is the managing director of our Center for Urban Resilience and the lead social scientist who led a number of the elements of this study. LMU was the lead organization on the study, but in order to do work like this, and when you're doing a study around a complex ecological issue, such as coyote management, you're really talking about at least three kinds of challenges. We're talking about the behavioral ecology of coyotes. We're talking about the behavior of humans as they live in their cities, and we're talking about their prey species, cats. And so it's really a complex interplay. And it's relatively easy for people to formulate opinions about coyotes, and people will freely give you advice. But when you're trying to solve a challenge like this, what you're trying to do is to reduce the uncertainty. Whenever you give advice, there's always uncertainty around it because the world can be unpredictable. So we actually used a large variety of research techniques, primarily so that we could reduce the uncertainties in the suggestions that we make. And those collaborators who helped us were Justin Brown from the National Park Service, who helped us with the radio telemetry aspects of the study, putting radio collars on the coyotes. That's one kind of data that we gathered. Jennifer Adams and Lisette Watts from the University of Idaho, who helped us with DNA analysis of the scat samples so we could gain additional information about these animals. John Huang from Utah State, and Rachel Blakely and Kaija Gom from UCLA, who helped us analyze our spatial data that we gathered from our radio telemetric studies. The folks from Culver City who started out with us, Deandra Bragg, Solveig Loken, Leon Lopez, Luis Martinez, Catherine Palmer, and Shelley Wolfberg gave us extraordinary logistical support during this work. Dr. David Kay from Southern California Edison helped us with land access, and additional support for some of this work was provided by the Annenberg Pet Space Foundation. We also had in excess of 20 students working with us on this project. There was so much data to analyze, and I won't list them by name other than Rebecca Davenport, who gathered and worked on a number of portions of the study, but focused her efforts on the photographic data. And from her analytics of those data, she was actually able to be the lead author on a paper that was published in the journal Peer J, looking at the overlap of cat and coyote activities, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. And her work was actually awarded by the National Wildlife Society as one of their papers of the year. So we submitted the report in the fall of 2022 after 3 years of data. We come to you tonight. We've already presented a shorter version of this before the City Council. We were also scheduled to do a long version of a presentation back in January, but it turned out the meeting went so late that our presentation would have been after midnight. And we actually had flown Dr. Weaver back for the presentation, but as we're going tonight, we decided we would do this remotely. It also allowed us to record it so that it can be viewed at people's leisure. The goals of the project were to gather appropriate ecological, technical, and human social data to help us understand enough about local coyote ecology and the human-wildlife conflict. And as we talk about it more tonight, things are different in Southern California than they are in other parts of the country where these coyotes have been studied. We wanted to analyze these findings and compare it to other studies across North America, which we did. We compared with 25 other management plans that had been developed. We wanted to help develop some durable management interventions linked with formal and informal education to reduce the negative impacts of the expanding coyote population in Culver City and beyond. And we wanted to provide and continue to provide technical and educational support to Culver City officials and stakeholders in their effort to implement these goals and reduce coyote conflicts in Culver City so we can come up with a model for coexistence. The study employed a variety of various data collection methods, which we will go into in some detail farther into the talk, but we used remote camera traps, radio telemetric collars. We did a dietary analysis. We used direct observation. We used molecular analytics, social surveys of residents, informal conversations, and lots of data from local stakeholders. And during this 3-year study, we collected nearly 2 million remote photographs, radio collared 2 male coyotes, collected nearly 200 scat samples, surveyed 377 residents, developed educational resources in a backyard study that can help residents determine coyote risks in their own yard. And the key part in this report are the management recommendations. We're going to talk in detail about the recommendations, but I want to give you a sense of them so you can have that in your mind as we go through some of the details of the studies that we did. What are some of our key findings? Well, coyote densities were relatively stable, but prey species, especially rabbits during the 3-year study, fluctuated. That was linked to a decreased rainfall during the study. And similar data were gathered in the Sonoran Desert that we could compare to help us to understand this fluctuation. Studies in Chicago and North Carolina, where there was relatively low cat predation, found that cats avoided areas where coyotes are common. And that was the assumption that we held going into the study based on other long-term studies from parts of North America. But our study observed that cats overlap significantly with coyote locations and time of day, which increased their risk of predation. We'll talk about some reasons why later on. There are seasonal patterns to when coyotes spend more time within the city rather than the oil fields. There also appear to be a seasonal pattern to when cats appear in the coyote diet. It increases in the summer and fall and decreases in the winter. From our DNA analysis from scat samples, it suggests that there are likely 2 packs of coyotes entering and coursing through Culver City. The first is a pack that ranges from about 6 to 8 individuals near Marycrest Manor in the oil fields. The second does not appear to live in Culver City proper, but enters the city from Ballona Creek, where they appear to travel but do not have dens. Our dry scat analysis shows that the Marycrest Manor pack does not prefer cats as their top prey and typically had less than 5% cat in their diet. However, as the rabbit density decreased, we did see a change in their diet preference. And in the second year of the study, about 25% of the coyote scat that we sampled contained evidence of cats. We also, from our social survey, showed that about 2/3 of the respondents agreed that they understand coyote behavior and activity, and more than half agreed that they know where the coyotes frequent. This perceived knowledge goes against previous research and our own experience, suggesting a need for further outreach and education by the city. More than 1/4 of respondents indicated that they are unaware of the coyote management efforts that were ongoing, and we suggest that the city use a multifaceted outreach approach. That led us to a series of recommendations, which we will spend really the majority of this talk discussing, but we will give you a prelude to the various recommendations here. Recommendation 1, we need to increase the specialized education for stakeholders with respect to reducing risk. Recommendation 2, implementing a suite of interventions at the individual parcel and yard level that can decrease the potential threat for coyotes. Recommendation 3, the city should follow a tiered response to coyote management with respect to documented incidences and degree of risk. And recommendation 4, introduce an additional palette of strategies that can be applied to residential pet owners as they try to find a balance between pet safety and outdoor activities. At this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Weaver, who's going to take us through some of the more detailed analyses of the data that we gathered that led us to these recommendations. Melinda, if you please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I am an instructor now at ASU, but I am the postdoc researcher that spent a lot of time working with your coyotes there in Culver City. So I think we all know that urban areas are not devoid of animals. We can see lots of different animals in our urban areas. And here's just a little splattering of some of the photos that I captured right here in Culver City. So you can see, obviously, there's a variety of animals that might be interacting with each other, or that we might interact with. So how do we interact with these animals? Well, Eric, next slide. Often we feed them. We interact with them because we care about them. We like animals in our environment. We report higher levels of satisfaction with our environment when we see lots of animals. So naturally, we might do things to make it so that we can see more of them. And one of the animals that we commonly feed is cats. So here you can see a feeding station at one of Dr. Strauss's former sites in Rhode Island. Eric, if you go to the next slide. And then the next one. However, we see that when we start feeding animals around our houses, we're not only feeding the animals that we intend to feed, we're often feeding other animals. And animals in urban areas tend to have overlapping diets. They like the same things, and they kind of like the things that we feed. So they like our trash, our dog and cat food, our fruits and vegetables that we have in our yards. So we have a lot of incentive for them to come into the area and interact with each other at these food sources. Next slide, please. So when we look at coyote diet analysis, we try to figure out what they're eating. We can see that they are eating a lot of human-related foods. And this is a review study that was done a few years ago that where they sort of did an overview of the different studies that looked at coyote diets. And what they found was that cats were a very low percentage of the diet. There were a lot of human-related food sources, but they tend to prefer rabbits and rats more than cats. Next slide, please. But that's not what we see in Los Angeles, and Culver City kind of knows that firsthand. And so when we look at this, I know this is a big figure right here, but if you look at the x-axis down here, you'll see some places where you can see some of the things that coyotes are eating, and you see among them, you see the cats with, you know, different things like figs and squirrels and crickets. And so when you look at the in the urban areas, you see then that in Los Angeles, we're seeing that cats make up a significant portion of coyote diet. In fact, more than 40% in a lot of cases. Where in the rural areas, we see cats still a pretty low percentage of the diet, but still higher than what we're seeing in the other studies, upwards of 10%. So this was a study done by Justin and his team at up in the Santa Monica Mountains and around. And this was a citizen scientist study where people collected scat from all around Los Angeles and looked at the diet. So this is not specific to Culver City, but it is pretty locally specific to us. And what we see is a lot more cats in the diet than we see in places like Chicago, New York, Seattle, and other places where they've done similar studies. So next slide. So this really brings us to the crux of the study, is that this is what brought us into Culver City, is that there was a lot more interaction between coyotes and cats than what is typically known throughout the country. And as Eric mentioned, when we started the study, there had been something like 70 cats in 18 months eaten by coyotes. And by the first 2 years of the study that I had been there, the total had climbed to about 89. So we had 89 cats in about 2 years taken in Culver City. And we wanted to ask some questions of what is going on in this area that makes it so much different from Chicago and some of the other areas where coyotes are extensively studied. So here's how we did that. Eric, next slide. So this is a heat map of where we have seen coyote activity in Culver City. And this is something that the city did in conjunction with Loyola Marymount, where we just started tracking citizen data and looking at where we were spotting coyotes and where coyotes were doing the damage. And you can see that here it turns into two kind of really distinct clusters, where there's this area around Holy Cross Cemetery, Mary Cross Manor. There's some parks and golf courses over there in the oil fields. And then there's this other neighborhood that runs along the Bayona Creek that covers the areas of Lake Jasmine and all of that, where we were really seeing a lot of coyote activity. And again, there was a lot of interaction with cats. And of course, as pet owners, we wanted to figure out what was going on and if we could reduce that in any way. So this is where we sort of started with our collecting data. Next slide, Eric. So we started by putting out camera traps. So one easy way to figure out where you're seeing animals is to try to strategically place some camera traps where you can, that at the right distance, you can see most of the animals that are coming through the area. So that was our first stop. It's relatively uninvasive for the animals, and it doesn't involve a lot of money either. It just takes some, time and manpower. So we got out there, we put out some camera traps. Eric, if you go to the next slide. And we picked locations based on the heat map that I showed you a few minutes ago. So we picked the locations in the clusters where we saw the most coyote activity. And so we put at least one camera in most of the parks in Culver City. There were 7 parks in Culver City that got cameras. You can see we put quite a few around Mary Crest Manor and some of the walking paths along there. And then we put several along the creek. You can see if you look at those dots sort of all in a line at the top in the middle there. Those are all along the Ballona Creek, and we basically had one on each block to see where they were coming into the neighborhood and see if we could kind of figure more of that out. We started out with about 20 cameras, but as we would get more information from citizens, we would add more cameras. So because, sometimes when you're conducting a scientific study, you have to have very precise methods. And you start with the same number of cameras and you have to place them exact amounts apart. But we were doing this to gain information for the city. So we really responded a lot to what the citizens were asking for and what they were saying, and started adding cameras in where necessary. So if we started getting high reports in other areas, we would put them there. And I'll talk about one of the cases where that happened later on in the presentation. But this is what we started with. And Eric, if you go to the next slide. You'll see that this is where we put them. You put them pretty low to the ground, about knee height, so that they can catch not only coyotes, but some of the other smaller animals like rodents and rabbits that we might be interested in terms of what coyotes are eating. So in the parks, you probably saw them on poles around. In fact, we know some of them were seen because we got a lot of graffiti on them. But we had them on poles throughout the city, and then we put them on trees in areas where that was available in walking paths and things where we couldn't find poles. So next slide. And as Dr. Strauss mentioned earlier, we captured almost 2 million images. And a lot of those end up being people's feet walking by or tree branches blowing in the wind during a storm. But 3,500 of those were coyote images. And we also captured a lot of images of cats, raccoons, possums, skunks, squirrels, rodents, and rabbits. And we were able to determine that there were at least 2 packs of coyotes that frequent Culver City. And we saw up to 7 coyotes in one photo. And I will talk about that pack a little bit later on. But so we were able to collect a lot of data. And Eric, if you move to the next slide. And we were able to learn a lot of things from that. So, for example, coyotes are not the only predator in your urban areas. I don't know how well you can see it, but this middle daytime photo is a hawk capturing a squirrel. That was one of my favorite photos. You can really see some hunting in action here. You can also see on the bottom left a cat that had captured a rabbit. That was in a local apartment complex. And on the bottom right, you see a couple of animals fighting over their favorite food source. This in particular was some El Pollo Loco chicken. So very high value food source here. Next slide, Eric. And of course, what everybody wants to see, the coyote photos. On the bottom right there is one of my very favorite photos of all time. That is a coyote in a rodent hole. So that's how they hunt. There were probably about 20 photos of the coyote standing over it, looking over it, trying to decide what to do. And then all of a sudden, the next photo, he's vertical in the air going in, he or she is vertical in the air going into the hole. So we've got all of these photos, 3 of these 4 photos, nope, half of them are at Mary Crest Manor. The other half are at Culver City Park. So the one in the bottom left and top right are both taken in that top parking lot where all of the Little League fields are in Culver City Park. Next slide. And here are some other things that we can see. We can see a lot of the interactions. As you can see here on the left side, there was a litter when our first pack we first started observing this first pack. And they had a litter of 4, and you can see them here interacting. You can also see them carrying trash, or I believe that's a possum. in these photos, so we can see them hunting and other things like that in the photo. So it's not just necessarily still images. Sometimes we would actually get some really cool, clear images of what was going on around the city. Next slide. And so, as Dr. Strauss mentioned, we had an undergraduate, Rebecca Davenport, who was basically looking then at all of these movement patterns and where we were seeing all these animals, where they were going, and how they were interacting with each other. And we wanted to compare those to some of the other studies, similar studies that were done around the country. And what we see in other studies, so this is Chicago. You hear me bringing up Chicago several times, but a lot of the work done on coyotes has been done in Chicago. They have like a program that has lasted like 25 years where they've done a lot of the work. So a lot of the studies that we're citing have happened in Chicago. And in these studies, what we really see, what you're looking at in this graph, is that cat and coyote movement patterns don't interact. Except for in maybe some urban woods, we don't see cats and coyotes interacting very much. We see that coyotes prefer the more rural areas, the more like grassy, wooded areas, and cats prefer more of the urban neighborhoods. Next slide. We see this in North Carolina as well. We see that cats typically avoid where the coyotes are, and coyotes tend to prefer these wooded or protected areas. So you just don't see a lot of overlap between the coyote and cat populations. So this might be a big reason why we see cat as a smaller proportion of the diets in other cities, because what we saw, next slide, in our study is that we saw a significant overlap between coyote and cat interactions. And what you're looking at this graph here is you're basically looking at the prime times when coyotes and cats are active. So you can see time of day on these lines. You can see when coyotes are interacting with cats, and the other one is coyotes and rabbits. So you see the time of day and what proportion of the activity there is. And then in the shaded gray area is where you see overlap of coyote and cats in the same sites. So we looked at when we were capturing cats on camera and when we were capturing coyotes on camera. And what we found was that cats in Culver City prefer all sites equally. You see them in the wooded areas and the bigger parks, as well as in the urban areas. So while coyotes still tend to prefer these larger grassy or wooded areas, cats actually have no preference. You can find them everywhere. So where in many other cities we see a distinct preference where cats and coyotes are not overlapping in their activity, in Culver City we actually saw a significant overlap. Cats are going to the places where coyotes are. They aren't avoiding them. And so that leads us to understand that not only do we need to understand the coyote behavior, but we need to understand the cat behavior, because what we're seeing in Culver City is some really unique cat behavior versus the coyotes are doing what we would predict them to do. They're trying to avoid the really urban areas. However, we'll talk about some exceptions to that as we move through the rest of the data. So this was just our first finding based on our camera analysis. Eric, next slide. And one thing that I wanted to highlight, I mentioned that we switched cameras around when we needed to. And one of the big ones that we noticed was this El Marino Park. When I started the study, there were absolutely no coyote reportings around there. And then probably about 8 to 10 months into the study, I started hearing from residents all the time. We're seeing so many coyotes in our area. We're seeing cat skulls. We're seeing all of these things happening around El Marino Park. Can you help us out? So I immediately put some cameras out in this area, and I started seeing what I saw was I saw a sharp increase in cats on the camera, and then right after that, I saw a sharp increase in coyotes on the camera. So I went around the neighborhood. I was trying to figure out what's going on. I started talking to residents, and it turns out that residents had recently started feeding a feral cat colony there. So as the feral cats started coming into that area, the coyotes started coming into that area as well. So they will sort of follow the food. Often they're not even looking for cats, they're just looking for the food that's being put out. But we started to see these, we started to see changes even throughout Culver City as time went on, based on where we saw cats was then where we ended up seeing coyotes. Next slide. And just as a quick note, this is a coyote baby. And one of the other cool things that we got to do with our cameras was that we had them in a place with a known pack for 2 years. And we got to see the changes in the pack population over time. And that's another really valuable use of these Coyote cameras, is that we saw in the first year where prey was very abundant, we saw that the pack had 4 offspring in the first year of the study. And in the second year, they only had 1 offspring, and it was very late in the year. So we saw sort of, as we were watching, we saw a decline in the pack size, and we saw a couple others disperse. So we are also able to, through these cameras, monitor the size of the pack and kind of give you as residents an idea of how many coyotes are living around your area. Next slide. And while camera traps are very valuable for sort of learning what animals are in the area and where they're going, we really wanted to get a comprehensive look at what was happening with these coyotes. So we also radio collared 2 different coyotes. And that involves putting out traps. We collaborated with the National Park Service, and we were able to put collars on 2 male coyotes. Next slide. And you can see one of them here. This is C165. We captured him as a juvenile male. And we were able to, from the data, look at sort of territory size. We determined his territory size to be about 39 kilometers squared. And we were also captured what we believe to be his father, but the dominant male of the pack, C171, who was a little bit larger male. And we'll talk about their differences in their movement patterns later, but he had a smaller territory size, about 15 kilometers squared. And that could be because as a young male, C165 was out looking for mates and traveling. In fact, one time we picked up a radio signal all the way down by the beach in Playa del Rey from him, where he seemed to be looking for a mate. And that could have ultimately contributed to his demise. He was hit by a car in 2022. So we are no longer getting data from him. Now we just have C171 as the data, but we were able to see exactly where they went on a day-to-day basis. And Eric, if you go to the next slide. So here you can really see, this is all of the data that we collected in 2 years. So here you can see everywhere that these 2 coyotes went in 2 years. This is a lot of information, so I'm going to sort of explain this slide and then show you an easier to read next slide. But this really shows you everything that we saw in 2 years. So if you look at, you can see the number in the middle, and that's how many times the coyote was recorded at that spot. So you can see, numbers in red, the coyote was reported at that spot at 206 times or 290 times. You can see in yellow where they're going to be a little bit bigger numbers, in blue they're a little bit smaller. But you can see where we're seeing lots of coyote activity. And if you look at this, you can really see that they're not in the neighborhoods all that much. And Eric, if you go to the next slide, I think it's a little bit easier to see here. So this is just the month of July 2022. And this allows you, with fewer data points, actually allows you to sort of see exactly where the coyotes are in relation to the neighborhoods. So you can see that they're in Holy Cross Cemetery a lot. They come up into Mary Crest Manor. They spend a lot of times in the oil fields. And when they do get into the neighborhoods, they're actually, the ones that we radio collared, are actually going into Baldwin Hills. So you see them at Kenneth Hahn State Park a lot, and there's a golf course right next to there where you see them quite a bit. But their neighborhood travels tended to go more toward Baldwin Hills. And they actually didn't spend a lot of time in Culver City, except for Culver City Park, and then some of those parks, El Marino Park and Blanco Park, some of the areas where we were seeing a lot of the cat colonies. So next slide. So we collaborated with a couple of different universities to try to figure out if there were any sort of patterns in the movement. And I don't expect you to be able to read this graph at all. In fact, when I first received the graph, I had to do a Zoom call with the Utah State researcher and say, okay, tell me how to read this graph. So I don't expect you to understand. I'm going to explain it to you a little bit. And just so you see, so you can see on the x-axis, you have the months. They are not in January, February, March, April, May order. They are in numerical order. So we have January, October, November, December, Then we have February at the bottom. And we have basically sort of a trend of where 165 likes to go versus where 171 likes to go, and then sort of a population average. So you see 165 in the orange, 171 in the green, and on the y-axis, it's the proportion that they prefer rural areas to urban. So you can see here our first number even starts at 3, which means that they prefer the rural areas 3 times to the urban areas. So they spend 3 times as much of their time in the urban areas as the rural areas. And C165 even more preferentially preferred that rural area. You can see that he sometimes 6 times prefers the urban areas to the rural areas. And what was interesting, though, what we can really learn from this is what we learned from C171. C171 tends to find himself, according to the data, in the city a little bit more often. And if you look at some of these little dots, where kind of closer to the bottom, that's going to be time periods when they're spending more of their time in the city. So more, like only half of their time in the rural areas versus the city. And you can see that those times when those are lower, it was October, November, December, September also. So we see them in the city a little bit more often in those months. And if you go to the next slide, we can also look at time of day. And so you can see that in the daytime, you can still see them in the urban areas occasionally, but they are tending to prefer to spend a lot of their time in the rural areas. And if you look at the color of the dots that we see down here, we see 171 in the urban areas more often at night than during the day. And so now that we know where they go, what they're doing, we wanted to also take a look at their scat. And when we talk about that, that's a fancy way of saying poop. So yes, I was out in the field during COVID collecting coyote poop. That was my job. That's what I did for a living. And there is a couple of things that we can learn from doing these, from looking at the scat. And primarily we can learn what's in their diet, but we can also learn how many individuals that we have. So when we set out to look at this data, not only did we want to do what's called a dry analysis, where we go through, oh, Eric, you can go to the next slide, sorry. We wanted to do not only a dry analysis, which basically means that because we didn't have a lab during COVID, I was doing this in my house. So we had a little oven that we borrowed from another lab, and you have to cook it for 24 hours to kill all the bacteria. And then you wash it in a washing machine. So I had a mini washing machine on my patio of my apartment complex where I would wash coyote poop during COVID. And then you're able to take it out, and all that's left of the coyote poop is the hair and bones that's left over, right? All of the excess stuff is out. And you can then take that hair and look at it under a microscope. Thankfully, my undergraduates did that for me. But you can look at it under a microscope, and you can tell based on the follicle the differences in the hair. And so you're able to identify cat hair, rabbit hair, rodent hair. Those were the specific things that we looked at in the dry analysis. And that tells us what percentage of each animal we're seeing in the scat samples. And then we also sent away the samples. We took little pieces out of each one and sent it to a lab in Idaho for DNA analysis. And that allows us to see how many individuals that we might have in the pack, how many individuals there are, and where, if we're seeing different scats in different areas, are they related to the ones that we're seeing at Marycrest Manor, or how many packs are there? And we're able to actually sex the individuals as well. So what we found from this information was that there was our Marycrest Manor pack, which we knew about, and at one time there were at least 8 individuals in the pack, 6 males and 2 females, which is a little unlikely, but interesting. So mostly males in that pack. And the scat that we found at Marycrest Manor was a DNA match to the scat that we found at Culver City Park and Lindbergh Park. So we know that the coyotes from Marycrest Manor are making it there. However, we did find scat along Viona Creek that did not match with any of the members of the Mary Crest pack. So that leads us to believe that there is a pack of animals, or it's just a sort of a highway where traveling coyotes can go through. So we believe that many of the coyotes are accessing Culver City just from the creek and may not be members of any pack at all. So in fact, my undergrads and I went looking for a den to see if we could find where in Culver City this pack was. And we walked the entire creek from one end of Culver City to the other. We actually went past the Culver City boundary, and we found what potentially could have been a denning site with some scat around it on the other side of the 405, kind of further into, that's probably Los Angeles County. But we could not find anything that resembled a denning site in Culver City. So there's definitely a pack that doesn't den in Culver City, but may use it as part of its territory. So those were the really interesting things we were able to learn from the DNA analysis. And then if we go to the next slide, I'll get to the scat analysis.
Just a second, Melinda, the image that you have there, that's a rabbit, right?
That's a rabbit in the mouth of the coyote. Yes. Okay, so you can see this is the first year of the study. This is 2020. And you can see that, in fact, we didn't find hardly any cats at all in the Mary Crest Manor scat. So because we had such few scat from the Viona Creek, this is only going to be Mary Crest Manor scat. And what was really cool about Mary Crest Manor is that Southern California Edison had a small piece of land right next to Mary Crest Manor. And the coyotes frequently would scat along that area. And so once a month, they would allow us in there to collect scat. So we were able to really have a longitudinal look at what was in the diet for this particular pack. So this is only going to be representative of the one Mary Crest Manor pack, but it's over 2 years. So that's really interesting information to look at. And if we would have looked at it over just 1 year, what we would have seen is this pack doesn't like cat at all. In fact, we hardly saw any at all. When we did, it was less than 10%, very similar to what you see in Chicago and New York and Seattle and all of these other cities. So we really see that they're preferring rabbit and rodent. Well, what happens in the next year? Next slide, Eric. In 2021, we see a big difference. And what you might notice right off the bat is that we start not seeing any rabbit at all versus how they were a huge percentage of the diet in 2020. And so we started, thinking, well, what's going on here? What's happening with that? And when we went back and looked at the photo data, we saw in 2020, you could see up to 40 rabbits in one photo at Mary Crest Manor. They were everywhere. It was insane. My undergrads hated me for having to count every single rabbit in every single photo. And by 2021, we would see maybe 2 once a week in Mary Crest Manor. So there was a real decline in the rabbit population. So again, you want to ask questions about that. What is going on with that? And if you go back and you look at the rainfall data in Los Angeles, the year before I arrived for the study and the first year of the study, there was more than 15 inches of rain in Los Angeles both those years. In the first year that I was doing the study, which then would have gone into the second year here, so 2020 to 21, Los Angeles only had 5 inches of rain that year. So, and if you look at, I did some more research. If you look at studies throughout the Sonoran Desert, researchers find that when rainfall declines, so do rabbit populations. They seem to their abundance seems to be very highly correlated with the rainfall, which makes sense because, they're eating plants. So it's a possibility that as droughts increase in Los Angeles and rabbit populations decrease, or droughts increase in Los Angeles, rainfall decreases and rabbit populations decrease, that we might start seeing more interactions between coyotes and cats, because as you can see, as we started to see a decline in rabbits in the diet, we started to see an increase in cats. So if you look at October, that is the greatest month of cat in the scat, and that's about 25%. But we see it increasing starting in June. We see it increasing all throughout that time. And then decreasing a little bit in December, and maybe that's some like winter rains are causing them to have more food out there. But and we really see that this also sort of overlaps. If we go back and look at our radio collar data, this really overlaps with when we started to see 171 going into the city more often. We saw him more often in those winter months, and we see that the cat is starting to appear more often in those winter months. So again, they're preferring the rodents and the rabbits when they have them available, but when they don't, they seem to be supplementing with cats. So that's the really interesting thing that we learned from our diet study, and we were able to correlate it with some natural phenomenon, which is that rainfall seemed to really heavily influence their prey sources, whereas rainfall is not going to influence cats because they're carnivores, they're eating different things. Okay, next slide, Eric.
And here, thank you so much, Melinda, for your insight. And now we're going to switch to our social scientist, Dr. Michelle Romolini. Thank you. If you can pick up from here.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Melinda. So I'm going to talk about our resident survey and some of our educational initiatives. And one of the things that I think is a little different about our center is that we do community-based research that really combines the ecological and the social, because as Dr. Strauss talked about, we really, the conflicts that we find in urban interfaces are not solved or not addressed only by looking at one area. We can't just look at the coyotes to understand how we can manage a coyote and human conflict. We have to also understand human behavior. And so we often employ social science methods in addition to ecological science methods. So I'm going to talk about our resident survey. Next slide, Eric, please. So we conducted a resident survey in April and May of 2022. And throughout April of 2022. And you can see here, we did some in person and then some online. This flyer on the right is from advertisements. Mostly the survey was advertised through Culver City outlets, including online, email, the website. But then we also had this advertisement on buses. And then you can see our undergraduate research assistant approaching people in public. We did in-person intercept surveys in public places, including parks, City Hall, and other open spaces. Next slide. So this was an 18-question survey. We were able to get responses from 377 adult residents of Culver City. We only are allowed by our ethical board to survey adults. The survey was conducted, sorry, yes, I knew I had the dates wrong, from February to April 2022. It ended in April 2022, online and in person. And we asked questions about people's perceptions and knowledge related to coyotes. We also asked questions about demographics to understand if we were best representing folks from Culver City. And so I'm just going to go through a few of the results that are highlighted on the next slides. First, in the knowledge and opinions section, we asked folks to respond to statements with agree to disagree. So that spectrum. And these three statements: I understand coyote behavior and activities. I know are coyotes frequent in Culver City, and coyotes should be allowed in Culver City, give us an idea of what residents are, how the residents perceive knowledge about coyotes and their behavior and their activities, as well as their opinions about, how they feel about the presence of coyotes in the city. So you can see here, we found that more than half of respondents both agreed that they understand behavior and activities. About 2/3 agreed with that. And then over half agreed that they know where coyotes frequent. But in looking at other studies in LA County and around the country, really, we find that the general public typically has poor knowledge of coyote ecology behavior and how to react to a coyote encounter, we tend to take information and not necessarily understand the nuances of the coyote behavior. We also found with the opinion that respondents were really evenly divided, almost exactly. So on whether coyotes should, 39% believed that coyotes should be allowed in Culver City, and 40% believed that coyotes should not be allowed in Culver City, with a little over 20% just feeling neutral on the subject. Next slide. We also asked about pets, right? Because the motivation, as we've been talking about, of this study was really to, in response to this cat and coyote conflict. So we asked folks, do you have pets? What type of pets? And then a follow-up question asked about, do you have concerns about your pets related to coyotes? And we found that more than 2/3 of the respondents had pets at home. And then about 2/3 of those pet owners reported that they had safety concerns with their pets and coyotes. Most of the respondents, 80%, indicated that they'd never feed their pets outside, which was, as you saw in Melinda's slides, good to hear for us. But there were 20% that feed pets outside, at least occasionally. And as we saw, that can attract coyotes, as we saw in the data that has been shown to attract coyotes in some of the places where we worked. Next slide. So of those, we then wanted to kind of focus in on cats and the environment, because we're really seeing, right, that cats are of biggest concern. So the respondents that had outdoor cats were asked about their cat's relationship with the environment. And we asked how their cat either benefits or harms the natural surroundings. And in that question, 39% chose that the cat neither benefits or harms the natural surroundings, and then 40% chose that the cat actually benefits the natural surroundings. And this to us just, said that about 80% of outdoor cat owners have the thought that their cat may be beneficial, or at least doesn't cause harm to the local ecosystem. But really, I just wanted to talk about this finding because we know that cats prey on rodents, right? And we know that rodents are coyotes' primary preferred source of food, that or freely available, food that's left out by humans. So if cats are preying on rodents, then that's reducing the available prey and competing with coyotes for prey. And so we may then assume or think, it's possible that coyotes are then using cats as a replacement for prey. So this is just another area where we think that some educational outreach targeted specifically on some of these findings to highlight this, the findings from our camera traps and our SCAT data would help to illuminate some of these challenges to residents that have outdoor cats. Next slide, Eric. So then we also asked, thinking about education and outreach and information, we asked residents that responded, where do you learn about the city's coyote management efforts related to coyotes? And we did find a large number of folks got information from the Culver City social media. We also did find, though, that about a quarter reported they didn't know about the coyote management efforts. And so that suggests they're not, visiting the website or getting information about coyotes from the city. And then, you see here personal social media and word of mouth being high sources of information. And sometimes those types of information can also spread misinformation. And so what we want to do with some of our educational outreach is try to provide information that is accurate about where the coyotes are and their behavior, and also how to best respond. Okay, next slide, please. So thinking about outreach and education, we, as part of our work, we used our research and our findings along with, as Dr. Strauss had mentioned, reviewing the management plans of 25 other cities and lots of other resources to develop some targeted resources for Culver City. Next slide. So we have both formal and informal education resources. This shows our Urban Coyotes curriculum, which is created for high school students. And it's a 5-week, 5-lesson module in Urban Coyotes. And it's hyper local, using our data from Long Beach, our previous study, but really focused on our work in Culver City, to provide a classroom experience where students can learn in the classroom, but also do some interactive activities at home and sort of in the outdoor classroom. So I have just here showing all of the lessons, but then each one drops down and you have various resources to support that, any teachers that might want to use this module. Next slide, Eric. We also developed a backyard survey that can be part of the 5-week curriculum, but we also used it as part of our study. So we had a number of residents actually do a backyard self-assessment. So looking at how, what is the risk of coyotes and what can we do as homeowners or as residents to help alleviate some of that risk. So the backyard survey is a tool that can be used in the classroom, but also can be used by any resident. Next slide, please. And then we had a number of informal educational resources. So we created an informational video. Melinda put together slides based on all of the data, but really distilled down into, manageable, a more manageable information source than an hour-long presentation or a 61-page report. And so this is, I think it's about 7 minutes. It's on YouTube. It's on our channel. It's also available through Culver City website. And it gives a bunch of information as well as very specific data and recommendations. Next slide. And then we put together a calendar of seasonal coyote information. So this is based on, our work and what we found, as well as tips from coyote management programs. And so this can be used in social media outreach, and it can also be used, by residents to understand how they might, how they might change their behavior in certain times of year to help avoid some of this coyote conflict. And so this is just, a snapshot of what we produced, and I think that is the end of the educational section. Yep.
Yes,
Okay,
it is.
Eric,
Thank
back
you.
to you. Yep.
All right, and certainly Michelle and Melinda, please feel free to jump in the section of recommendations. We're going to fly through them, and they're in much more detail in the report that we've done, and we also stand by. I mean, we are local, we are committed to this study, and we want to see the resolution of the challenges. And so, as these recommendations are in place, we stand ready to provide more information and more advice. So under the rubric of the first recommendation, increasing specialized education for stakeholders to reduce coyote risk. Remember that risk is driven both by human social factors and the highly variable behavior among coyotes based on their age, their social status, their prey availability, and drought conditions. So the response of the community is going to be contextual. And it suggests then that the maps, the digital maps that are available of coyote interactions, where cats are being taken. Those are incredibly important, need to be maintained. But in a general basis, we need to make sure that people are removing all sources of food and water from areas that coyotes are frequenting. Cleaning up downed or low-hanging fruit or fruit from trees. Keeping pets indoors at night and inspect the yard before letting them out. Maintain your fences and trim vegetation. Coyote rollers, although expensive, are also very expensive. I mean, very effective for people who have fenced-in yards. Install motion sensor lights. The flash of light can disorient and cause a coyote to leave. Don't approach or feed coyotes, and teach your children not to do so. We still have people that are putting food out for other animals and indirectly feeding coyotes, or people who have affinities for coyotes who are putting food out for them directly. Walking animals on a short leash, especially walking your dogs on a short leash, carrying a stick, pepper spray can be helpful. Don't turn your back or run from a coyote. That just encourages them to chase you. We're going to talk a little bit about hazing later in the presentation. And don't let your pets interact with coyotes. And make sure you close your pet doors at night. Recommendation 2, implementing a suite of interventions at the individual parcel level in your backyard that could decrease the potential threat from coyotes. We do recognize and understand that cat consumption is higher in Southern California than other states across North American cities. It's the mild climate and drought are altering both cat and coyote behavior that put them in closer contact with each other than in other urban settings. And look, I understand the trauma affiliated with this. I'm a pet owner myself. When I was living on Cape Cod, we had a very close interaction with one of my golden retrievers who chased a pack of coyotes, and they turned on her. And amazingly, she lived to tell the story. But it was an extremely traumatic experience for me. And I was in the middle of studying coyotes at the time. And so I feel informed by the concerns you have as pet owners and motivated by it as well. First, you really need to reduce the resources in your yard that coyotes find attractive. Pet food, water, shelter, fruits, etc.
If I
Remember,
could just jump in real quickly here.
yeah.
Most people don't realize coyotes love lemons, limes, oranges, figs. Like they eat things that we think like our dog would completely turn their nose at. So we don't think they're going to want them. But downed fruit in your yard is one of the most common things that coyotes will enter for.
Yes, when you look at scat analysis of coyotes from other studies, sometimes their scat is 80% fruit remains at certain times of the year. So the making your yard resource free applies to your neighbors as well. Remember, coyotes they're coursers, they're always hungry. If they find something in your yard, they're going to come back over and over to look. The secret is to make sure they don't find something there, and so your yard falls off of the list of things they're willing to check. Wildlife feeding stations for feral cats and other mammals should be eliminated, and in most parts of Los Angeles County are not legal to begin with. And take the backyard risk assessment survey and respond. Take the survey, take a hard look at your backyard. Recommendation 3, following a tiered response to coyote management with respect to documented incidences. We offer in the report a detailed chart of scaled management responses to coyotes. Total removal of coyotes is likely impossible. Lethal removal is a necessary management tool, but should be used only with an understanding of its limitations and pitfalls. Most coyotes can be managed through yard management, hazing, and resource control. There are instances when there's a documented attack or something like that, that the coyote will end up needing to be removed. But remember, when you remove a territorial coyote, you open up the space for other coyotes to move in who don't know the areas well and are more likely to try and exploit human food resources. And so, for our example in the Mary Crest Manor Pack, we know where they are. You could go and trap and remove some of those animals if the city chose to do so. But those coyotes are pretty good neighbors with respect to their impact on human pets and our resources. And so removing them would likely be a mistake unless one of them turns rogue. So if we talk about an example of scaling, we have this detailed reporting is so important with respect to the city's ability to make the appropriate decision, targeting education efforts, aversive conditioning, and finally targeted lethal removal if necessary. One of the reasons that this study will be effective to you is that if you have to use lethal control at some point, you have documented your efforts to try and use an integrated model first. Recommendation 4, introducing a palette of strategies that can be applied to residential pet owners as they try to find this balance between pet safety and outdoor activities. This idea of an understandable, considered coexistence. Enhance specialized education for pet owners. Use the school-based curriculum on coyote human conflict and ecology that leads to solutions. We're happy to run workshops for the teachers so they learn how to use this. Specialized training for cats, similar to the snake training that they use for dogs in areas that are snake prone. Cats can, and in our discussions with cat behavior experts and cat aggression experts, cats that turn towards a coyote present 5 fighting surfaces, 4 sets of claws and teeth, and they do a much better job of surviving a coyote interaction than a cat that just turns and runs, which becomes something to be chased. Also implementing a more sophisticated and consistent program for hazing coyotes before they become more aggressive. I've talked to a number of people who are concerned that hazing is not an effective tool. And the data are relatively scarce. There are papers that suggest it is effective. There's some work that suggests that more work needs to be done. We know that effective programs have been used as close as the Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station RV Park, also in Denver, Colorado, Utah State University. The findings suggest that it's a resident science program. People need to be trained. They need to be consistent. If you're going to use hazing, then it has to be consistently used. It has to be used to the point that the animals actually move away and not just back off a little bit, because otherwise they learn to think that hazing really doesn't matter. And here we talk about hazing. Hazing should be used only when appropriate, when coyotes are approaching their humans and their pets or occupying human areas. Hazing needs to be aggressive. It's designed to startle and disorient the coyote. The more a coyote is hazed by a variety of people in a variety of ways, the more effective the hazing will be. The coyote must understand that hazing is coming from the human, so the hazer must be visible to the coyote when it takes place. Hazing can take the form of aggressive stances, yelling and arm waving, utilizing tools such as noisemakers, projectiles, hoses, water guns, vinegar, and hazing must continue until the animal leaves. It needs to be consistent and each time the animal shows up. And hazing is not designed to injure the animal. It's designed to be aggressive and unpredictable. And so the state of California Division of Fishery and Wildlife provides workshops and support. Probably your animal control officer in Culver City can help you do that. So before we take questions, I thought we thought about what some of these questions might be, and so we'll go down this list. First of all, are all coyotes presenting similar risks? Absolutely not. That's a very important part to understand, both from our studies and others. Most coyotes are not a threat to humans. Most of them focus their diets on non-anthropogenic sources and are actually relatively beneficial to the ecosystem. But we do need to have specific management tools for those that are presenting behaviors that are problematic. Second, why can't we just eliminate coyotes from Culver City? Wouldn't that be more efficient? Well, some cities have tried, and in general, those efforts are not completely successful, and they cause a completely disrupted territorial system that ultimately results, at least for short periods of time, with an increase in population density as the territorial boundaries break down. Remember, coyotes are highly territorial dogs. Most coyotes spend their time marking their territories, and other coyotes won't enter those territories because their interactions can be lethal with one another. And so when those territory boundaries break down, your local densities can increase. We demonstrated that directly in previous studies we did in the Northeast. Why are coyotes so unpredictable? Well, they're unpredictable to us because when we see a coyote, we don't necessarily know its age, its social condition. Is it on its territory? Is it dispersing from its natal territory? Has it been injured? Is it sick? All of these elements can change the behavioral ecology of the animals you encounter them. And that's why I think it's wrong to simply treat every coyote the same way. We need to have this tiered response in response to the signals the coyote sends us. We've also had people ask, why did the study take so long to complete? Well, in fact, a 3-year study is a relatively short study in order to measure variation. And at least we were able to see different climatic conditions, and we were able to demonstrate that coyotes were behaving differently under different rainfall regimes, which may be an important indicator to us. If we'd done the study for only 1 year, that pattern wouldn't have arisen. Also, that there's significant variation in their reproductive success. That's also important for us to understand. What key aspects of the ecology study did we learn from this study that we wouldn't have understood from reading the other studies? And that's a common question, and I understand that. You know, whenever you're spending public resources to gather information or in any public resource, we should be able to defend why we did that. And I think that the data in some ways speak for themselves. The behavior of coyotes in Southern California look different from really a gold standard study that's been done in Chicago that's been going on for more than a decade, and they've collared hundreds of animals. It's the best study that's ongoing in the country right now. But our study demonstrated that the coyotes in Southern California have significant and important differences we need to be concerned about. And finally, how will our team continue to help Culver City manage their coyote issues? Well, we're right next door. You can call us at any time. We're happy to provide suggestions and advice to city managers. As I said, we have a curriculum that we've developed for the Culver City schools. And because of the challenges provided by COVID and the recovery from COVID and all of that, we still stand by and are ready to provide workshops for those teachers and administrators so they can learn how to use those resources. So again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you again to the large research team that helped us conduct this work. Thank you to the residents of Culver City for collaborating with us. And thank you so much to the members of the Culver City staff who were so helpful in the logistics. So Shelley, that wraps up the formal part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the LMU team. And I want to express my appreciation for this outstanding research, and it's very interesting as well. So thank you for leading this effort. And what I want to try to do is, if you can, for people on the call, if you can post a question in the chat that you want to be unmuted, I can unmute you if you have any questions or comments. So give folks a moment to do that. Okay, Deborah, I'm going to unmute you. Just bear with me for a moment, okay? Don't touch your computer there. Okay, Deborah, you're unmuted, and good to hear from you. Go ahead, Deborah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can. It looks like you're signed on 3 times.
No. Well, I kept getting bounced. So there's a terrible echo, so I'll keep my question very brief. I don't know how I ended up 3 times, but I'm honored. Why are there years when there are more coyotes and years when there are less coyotes?
Okay, thank you. So I'll start, and then Melinda, maybe you can jump in. So it turns out that in urban areas, coyotes don't live as long as they do in rural areas. Our long-term study and other long-term studies, when we were doing the study back on Cape Cod, we ended up doing the study for over 10 years. And it turns out that we did a study in Boston, and then we had a similar study running parallel on Cape Cod in more rural areas. And the coyotes on Cape Cod lived almost twice as long. And so because of that, there's a very high mortality rate for urban coyotes when they cross roads and potentially consume poisons or other things like that. So as a result, there's a pretty significant turnover in population. And therefore, in a year when a pack might have 5 or 6 pups, and then as Melinda demonstrated another year, they only had 1 the next year that was driven by food resources and weather changes, then that's going to cause a pretty significant change in the population pretty quickly. And then on the larger scale, there are diseases, there are other things like mange that will go through a population that are natural. They tend to be accelerated in urban areas. There are natural forces that limit population size. So most animals, species, are on a cyclical population roller coaster, if you will, and the length of time between the maximum and minimums change and so forth. Melinda?
Yeah, you covered it pretty well. Coyotes tend to have litters based on what's going on in their environment and the resources available. So, in a resource good area, the populations can like really dramatically increase. I think that in urban areas where food sources tend to be more consistent, sometimes you don't see those big variations. However, in Los Angeles, with the, as we've shown, with the desert, kind of semi-desert climate, we do see differences in the resources. So there are going to be years where there's more, and there's going to be years where you're going to be seeing them more. So it's going to appear like there's more because they have fewer resources in their natural areas. So it might seem like there's more in some years. There's not necessarily. They might just be using the cities more for their resources.
Thank you. Let's see. I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. So definitely please raise your hand. Let's see. Or we can definitely wrap it up. This does not end the discussion. There are resources available and new outreach we're going to provide to the public to improve our situation here with coexisting with the coyotes. And as always, please feel free to email me or one of the animal services officers. And I just want to give the police department an opportunity to speak if you'd like to say anything. Okay, I'm going to take that as no more comments, no more questions. And so,
Shelley, let me just add as we wrap up that if it would be great if they could send questions directly to you, because you're our point of contact, going forward, the city. So if the city contacts us, we are happy to answer questions. We are happy to provide advice, that kind of thing. But the information flow should go through the city and then reach my office. And then I'm happy to respond and provide information as needed. We want to see this be successful. This could be a model for other cities.
absolutely. And for those of you who don't have my email address, it's my first name, Shelley, SHELLY .Wolfberg, WOLFBERG at culvercity.org. And how appropriate, there's another animal in my last name, which is the wolf. So, okay, well, thank you very, very much to our researchers and for everybody who's joined the call. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening. And I'm gonna sign
Thank
us
you
out.
all.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Shelley.
you.